And in response to Jonathan Diller's funeral, the New York Times is being called out for their, quote, disgraceful, deceitful report. The New York Post editorial board writing, quote, the Times stuck its report back on page A21 without even a tracer on the front page. The one local story that got that privilege was about New City trash containers. The article quoted the widow's eulogy, but not her most important or newsworthy appeal, not even in one of the online versions with no space limits at all, though it ran 1,100 plus words. Fox News contributor Joe Concha joins me now. Joe, good morning to you. You know, news organizations, they can put their thumb on the scale with what they report and also with what they don't report or what they bury. Is that what's happening here?
It's the bias of omission, right, Carly? And you say, well, they reported it, yeah, but on page A21, could you imagine, we've all seen the images, the overhead images of literally thousands of people showing up, a lot of police officers, obviously, to honor this poor man's life, who obviously was a dad to a 1-year-old and a loving husband, only 31 years old. And the New York Times, there are those images right there. Does that look like a page 21 story to you? The New York Times is increasingly showing that the only thing it's good for is to, you know, wrap fish with. Not only did they bury this story, as we said, all the way on page 21, but they included this doozy. Quote, some people, particularly Republicans, have seized on the killing, unquote. Then this so-called paper of record goes on to make an argument, again, in this story that should be honoring this man and his life, that, quote, murder, felony assault, and rape are down about 2% compared with the same time last year. In other words, they appear to be saying things are getting better, and this murder, it's just an exception. And you have to go 11 paragraphs down, Carly, before you learn that the man who carried out the murder had been arrested, as you just reported, nearly 24 times before, mostly on drug-related and assault charges. Again, 11 paragraphs in, they decide to include that little tidbit. So overall, what can you say? The New York Times, or the Post in this case, is absolutely right. This is disgusting. It is deceitful. And this man deserved much better from the so-called paper of record.
Yeah, you know, Joe, you make such a great point of the imagery of the thousands of police officers flooding a city in New York. It's the New York Times. And police officers from not just across the country, but around the world, there to honor him, a former president as well. That is major news. The other thing that makes it major news is that he's a young police officer with a beautiful 1-year-old boy killed by a criminal with 21 prior arrests. And the thing about this, Joe, is that President Biden constantly is trying to convince people that he is on the side of law enforcement and that he cares about crime. So when one of the biggest publications in the country, the New York Times, a paper that endorsed him last election cycle, is accused of burying this story, doesn't it make it even more difficult for the president to be perceived as tough on crime?
Oh, precisely, Carly. I mean, we talk about, yes, they endorsed Joe Biden in 2020. They haven't endorsed a Republican for president since 1956 in Dwight Eisenhower. And they've done obituaries before, by the way, Carly, for Qasem Soleimani, for example, called him the master of Iran's intrigue, a Shiite axis of power in the Middle East. The commander helped direct war in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and became the face of Iran's efforts to build a regional bloc of Shiite power. Oh, no mention in that he also killed hundreds of U.S. troops. So, again, what they do with some people, as far as the New York Times and their obituaries, and what they're doing here, night and day. And it's shameful at this point, and Joe Biden has a real problem because he could have attended those services last week and decided to hang out with Stephen Colbert, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton, raising millions of dollars instead. Yeah,
well, the New York Post published Stephanie Diller's eulogy in full, and it is a beautiful tribute to her husband, who's a hero. Her last line is, "Rest in peace, Jonathan, the man who captured my heart and now all of New York's." It was a beautiful speech, and you can find that on the New York Post. Joe, got to leave it there. Thank you so much. Fox and Friends starts right now.
Stronger.
surprise you?
No, it is actually unsurprising for Baltimore because they have issued unanimous decisions in certain cases where we thought they would be split. You know, there's a lot of pontificating about the court. People assume they know how these decisions are going to come down. But I do find that if recent history is a guide, they do tend to telegraph where they're going to come down in terms of the decision. And it was really Justices Alito and Thomas were the only ones to side with those seeking to alter the FDA regulation that would allow for these pills to be mailed to really good
Pro-choice on abortion, so the high court is getting some airplanes, or at least not getting public as they usually
And that's the nice thing about a lifetime appointment is you are not necessarily linked to the media. And, you know, it's always interesting to see where these alliances kind of unfold on the Supreme Court because, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, they were very close friends. They were not ideologically aligned.
So some of the anti-Trump pundits are just hailing this new poll by Bloomberg, which shows that Joe Biden is catching up with Donald Trump in three crucial swing states, 45-45 in Pennsylvania and Michigan, and Biden ahead 46-45 in Wisconsin. Now, we're getting a lot of like, I told you so, it was only going to take some time, people will come to their senses from people who are not big fans of the former president, but these are statistical times, which means that either Trump or Biden could be up by a couple of points. So I wonder if you think this is being just a tad overplayed.
Well, it's interesting here, Howie, because the polls are going to go in many different directions, and we're going to see a lot of tumult, and we'll probably see a lot of change. The only thing that matters is how someone actually votes when they either mail in their ballot in a lot of these particularly Democrat-heavy states, or when they're in the polling booth, when they're facing their conscience. I think that we're going to see a big shift. I don't think this is decisive. You also see polls that show that Trump still has a national lead. The Real Clear Politics average still has him up almost 2%.
Any poll is a snapshot, and these things bounce around. Now, very big deal made by CNN, MSNBC, and others about this fundraiser the other night, Obama, Clinton, and Joe Biden. And the New York Times had an interrogation by Stephen Colbert. But the New York Times had a whole piece saying, well, yeah, Biden's not as popular as the other two, but that's because we're in a much more polarizing era. Do you buy that?
No, he's not as popular as the other two because he's not as popular as the other two. And neither is his vice president. You know, Vice President Biden didn't really move the needle. It was President Obama who was the rock star of the administration. But the problem for President Biden is his vice president pulls him down, and by contrast, he just doesn't have the star power, certainly of Obama, but also, to some degree, President Clinton as well. So I don't know if optically this was the best look for the president. I know it's a big cash grab. I don't know if cash is enough to meaningfully move the needle where the Biden camp wants it right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, Biden's never been as much of an orator as the other two Democrats we're talking about. So before we go, what is your take on the revolt of the MSNBC liberals against NBC's hiring Ronna McDaniel, ripping the bosses on the air and forcing her to get fired within 4 days despite her big fat contract?
I think the bosses there are soft. I think the lunatics are running the asylum. I think they should all focus on their respective shows. And, you know, NBC was in the right wanting to find a proliferation of voices before the conventions and before the actual election. And, you know, Ronna McDaniel obviously would have been a great choice because she is polarizing. That means people would have tuned in to either grudge watch her or possibly agree with her.
It just is amazing the way in which the NBC caved on this and ultimately had no choice. I think it's been an embarrassing episode all around. Kennedy, great to see you. Thanks so much.